The wind had teeth, and it was biting deep into the bones of the world. It howled down from the jagged peaks of the Rockies, a pale and screaming thing that carried ice in its breath and scoured the high plains clean. It had driven the cattle to huddle, the wolves to their dens, and it had driven the woman to the very edge of her life. Her name was Clara. Though she had not heard it spoken with kindness in so long, it felt like a name belonging to a ghost. She stumbled into the town of Redemption Gap not like a visitor, but like a piece of driftwood washed ashore after a long and violent storm. The town was little more than a single, muddy street gashed into the endless white, lined with false-fronted buildings that slumped against one another for support. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching black smoke that was instantly snatched away by the wind, and a dozen or so houses scattered like forgotten dice. To Clara, who had walked for days with nothing but the horizon for a guide, it looked like the capital of the entire world. Her dress was a scandal in the making. A thin, faded calico garment more suited for a mild spring in Missouri than the brutal heart of a Wyoming winter. It was torn at the hem and stained with the memory of roads she had traveled. It did little to hide how thin she was, the sharp angles of her shoulders and hips speaking of a long acquaintance with hunger. The men who saw her, stamping snow from their boots on the boardwalk, saw the dress and the gauntness and the desperate look in her eyes and came to a simple, uncharitable conclusion. The saloon was always spitting out girls like her, used up, broke, and running from something. They nudged each other, their gazes lingering with a kind of predatory pity. The women of the town, peering from behind lace curtains, saw the same thing and their faces hardened. They pulled their children closer, their lips tightening into thin lines of judgment. Trouble had a look about it, and this woman was wearing it like a second skin. Clara felt their eyes on her, hot as branding irons on her frozen skin. She pulled the threadbare shawl tighter, a useless gesture against the cold and an even more useless one against their scorn. She had known scorn her whole life. It was the air she had breathed in her husband's house, the silent sermon delivered from the pulpit, the bitter taste in every sip of water. But this was a different kind of scorn, colder and sharper, the kind reserved for women who had fallen from a grace she had never been allowed to possess in the first place. She kept her eyes fixed on the sign for the general store, its painted letters flaking away under the relentless assault of the weather. Food. The word was a prayer in her mind. Just a little food, a heel of bread, a handful of dried apples, anything to quell the frantic gnawing in her belly. Her legs were trembling, not just from cold, but from an exhaustion so profound it had settled deep in her marrow. Each step was a negotiation with gravity. The world tilted and swam before her eyes, the edges blurring into a hazy white. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, cured tobacco, and oiled leather. The sudden warmth was a physical blow, making her dizzy. A pot-bellied stove in the center of the room radiated a heat that felt both wonderful and painful on her numb skin. A man with a grand mustache and a clean apron stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar. He looked up as the bell above the door announced her entry, and his welcoming smile faltered, then vanished completely. He took in her appearance with a swift, dismissive glance. Clara walked toward him, her movements stiff and clumsy, her fingers blue with cold, fumbled inside a small pocket sewn into the seam of her dress. They were numb, like clumsy wooden pegs, and for a terrifying moment she thought she had lost it. Then she felt the small, cool shape of it. She pulled it out and placed it on the worn wooden counter. It was a single silver earring, delicate and small, shaped like a teardrop. It was tarnished and plain, but it was real silver, her mother's, the only thing of value she had managed to bring with her from that other life. It was the last piece of the girl she had been.
"Please,"
she whispered, her voice a dry rasp.
"Some bread, and maybe some cheese."
The storekeeper, a man by the name of Silas Croft, stared at the earring. He did not touch it. He looked from the earring to her face, his eyes hard and appraising. He saw the dark, ugly bruise that bloomed across her cheekbone, the faint yellowing of an older one near her temple. He saw the chapped lips and the feverish brightness in her eyes. He had seen women like her before, plenty of them. They came with stories of lost luggage and cruel husbands, but it almost always ended the same way. "We don't trade for trinkets here, miss," he said, his voice flat. "Coin of the realm. Or greenbacks." "It's all I have," Clara said, the words catching in her throat. A wave of blackness washed over her, and she gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. "It's silver. It's worth something." "Maybe," Silas allowed, stroking his mustache. "But I ain't a jeweler. I run a store." He gestured vaguely toward the saloon across the street. "Perhaps they'd be more accommodating over there. They've got a softer spot for your kind." The insult landed, but she was too far gone to feel its sting. The heat of the room was suffocating her. The floor seemed to be rising up to meet her. The storekeeper's face dissolved into a meaningless blur. Her hand slipped from the counter. The last thing she heard was the faint, tinny clatter of the silver earring as it fell from her palm and rolled across the dusty floorboards. Then the world went dark. He was sitting in the corner by the stove, nursing a cup of coffee. When she came in, Elias Thorne had seen her stumble through the town, had seen the looks she received. He was no stranger to being on the receiving end of such looks himself. He watched the exchange at the counter, his face impassive, his gray eyes missing nothing. He saw the woman's desperation and the storekeeper's callous dismissal. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, the exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. When she fell, it was not with a dramatic cry, but with a quiet, final surrender, like a leaf letting go of a branch. Before Silas Croft could even come around the counter to fuss over the inconvenience of it all, Elias was there. He moved with a quiet economy of motion that belied his size. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder and lean in the hip, built by a life of hard work and solitude. He knelt beside her, his gloved hand gently brushing the matted hair from her face. The bruise on her cheek was stark against the pallor of her skin. He felt the frightening cold of her flesh even through the leather. "She needs a doctor," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "Doctor's out at the Miller Ranch. Won't be back till tomorrow. If the snow lets him," Silas said, wringing his hands. "I don't want no trouble here." "Elias, she looks like she's fled the cat house in Cheyenne." Elias ignored him. He slid one arm under the woman's shoulders and the other beneath her knees, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. Her head lolled back against his chest, and a soft, unconscious moan escaped her lips. As he turned to leave, his eyes fell upon the silver earring lying near the counter. He paused, then bent and picked it up, closing his large, calloused hand around the small piece of metal. He straightened and walked toward the door. The unconscious woman held securely in his arms. The men who had been loitering outside parted to let him pass, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They knew Elias Thorne. Everyone in Redemption Gap knew him, or at least they knew the story of him. He lived a solitary life in a cabin miles out of town, trapping in the winter and disappearing for long stretches in the summer. He kept to himself, spoke little, and had a stillness about him that most found unsettling. They remembered, years ago, when he had ridden into town and shot 2 men dead in broad daylight, right in the middle of the street. The men had been beating a stable hand half to death over a gambling debt. Elias had told them to stop. When they had drawn on him instead, he had been faster. The law had called it self-defense, but the town had rendered a different verdict. Some saw him as a righteous man, a quiet protector who acted when others would not. They were grateful for the rough justice he represented. Others saw him as a killer, a man with a dangerous temper lurking beneath a calm surface. They feared him, whispering that a man who kills once can easily kill again. He was a man who lived by his own code, and that made him an unpredictable and therefore dangerous element in their small, ordered world. So they watched him now, carrying this strange, broken woman. And they wondered. They whispered among themselves, weaving a new chapter into the legend of Elias Thorne. He carried her to his horse, a big roan that stood patiently at the hitching post. With practiced ease, he settled her in the saddle, mounting behind her and pulling her slight frame back against his chest. He wrapped a corner of his own heavy coat around her, trying to shield her from the wind that was now whipping the snow into a frenzy. He turned the horse and rode out of town, not looking back. The whispers followed him until the blizzard swallowed him whole. The ride to his cabin was a silent, grim affair. Clara drifted in and out of a shallow, fevered consciousness. She was vaguely aware of the steady movement of the horse, the solid warmth of the man's body behind her, the muffled sound of his heartbeat. At one point, her eyes fluttered open to a world of swirling white. She was cold, so cold she thought her blood had turned to ice. She tried to speak, to ask where he was taking her, but her lips would not form the words. She surrendered again to the darkness, trusting the stranger's arms only because she had no strength left to fear them. The cabin was small, just a single room, but it was built of sturdy, axe-hewn logs, chinked tightly against the wind. It was a fortress of solitude, nestled in a small clearing and surrounded by towering pines that bent and sighed under the weight of the snow. Inside, a stone fireplace dominated one wall. A bed was built into another corner, and a simple table and 2 chairs sat in the center. It was a space stripped of all but the essentials, the home of a man who needed little from the world. Elias laid her gently on the thick bear pelt in front of the hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but the room was still warmer than the world outside. He moved quickly, adding logs to the fire until flames licked up the chimney, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the fire. He looked down at Clara. Her clothes were damp, half frozen to her skin. He knew she needed to be stripped of them, to be wrapped in dry blankets before the chill settled into her lungs. Frostbite was eating at her fingers and the tips of her ears. He saw the way she shivered, a violent, uncontrollable trembling that shook her entire body. He knelt beside her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft, trying not to startle her. She was awake now, her eyes wide and full of a wild, cornered animal fear. "You need to get out of those wet things. You'll catch your death." Her eyes darted from his face to the door, then back again. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her. She was alone with a man, a large and powerful man, in a cabin miles from anywhere. She knew what men wanted, what they took. Her body was a map of that knowledge, a territory of pain and shame. The thought of him undressing her, of his hands on her skin, of his eyes seeing the landscape of her scars, was more terrifying than the cold. "No," she croaked, the word barely audible. She tried to curl into herself, to make herself smaller, to disappear. She clutched the wet fabric of her dress with her frozen fingers. Elias saw the terror in her eyes, and he understood it in a way he could not have explained. It was not the coyness of a modest woman. It was the raw fear of a horse that had been beaten. He had seen it before. He did not argue. He did not insist. He simply stood up and turned away from her, giving her his back. He went to a wooden chest at the foot of his bed and took out a heavy wool blanket, the kind meant for the coldest of nights. He walked back and laid it on the floor beside her, careful not to touch her. "The fire will warm you," he said, his voice still low and even, addressed to the stone wall of the fireplace. "I have to see to my horse. I will be outside for a time." He pulled on his coat and hat, picked up a lantern, and walked to the door without a backward glance. He opened it, letting in a swirl of snow and a blast of frigid air, and then closed it firmly behind him, leaving her alone in the warmth and the firelight. Clara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was alone. He had left. He had not forced her, had not touched her. He had offered her distance. It was a kindness so unexpected it felt like a trick. For a long time, she simply lay there, listening to the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. The wind was a familiar sound, a companion through her long flight, but the fire was new. Slowly, painfully, her numb fingers began to ache as warmth seeped back into them. The shivering did not stop. She knew he was right. The wet dress was leaching the life from her. With trembling hands, she reached for the blanket he had left. It was coarse and heavy, and it smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. She pulled it over herself, a shield against the cold and the fear. Beneath its cover, hidden from the judging eyes of a world that was not there. She fumbled with the buttons of her dress. The fabric was stiff with ice, and it took all her remaining strength to peel it away from her skin. She did not remove it entirely, but let it fall away, huddling naked under the heavy wool, her back to the door. She stared into the flames, her mind a blank slate of exhaustion. She had escaped one prison only to find herself in another, but this one, for now, was warm. When Elias returned, he did not look at her. He moved about the cabin with his quiet purpose, stamping the snow from his boots, hanging his coat on a peg. He ladled hot water from the kettle into a mug, adding a spoonful of broth powder from a tin. He set the mug on the hearth, a few feet from where she lay, still not meeting her eyes. "Drink this," he said to the floorboards. "It will help." He then moved to the other side of the cabin and sat at the table, his back to her, and began to clean his rifle. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the snap of the fire and the rising shriek of the storm. Outside, the snow began to fall with a new, silent fury. It was no longer a flurry, but a solid, descending curtain of white. It piled up against the cabin walls, burying the windowsills, climbing the door. The world outside was disappearing. The trail back to town, the mountains, the very sky itself, was being erased. The wind died down, and a profound, heavy silence fell, the silence of a world being buried alive. Clara sipped the hot broth, the warmth spreading through her chest. She watched the man's broad back as he worked, the steady, methodical movements of his hands. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He simply existed on his side of the room, a silent, watchful presence. The snow fell harder and harder, a soft, relentless tapping against the roof. It was the sound of their isolation becoming complete, for hours, for days, for weeks to come. There would be nowhere to go. There would be only the cabin, the fire, and the two strangers trapped within it. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. The storm was no longer an event with a beginning or an end. It was the state of all things, a relentless siege conducted by the sky. For days, the wind screamed, a constant, high-pitched mourner's wail that clawed at the logs and rattled the single window pane. Then, the wind would die, and a silence would descend. A silence so heavy and profound it felt like the world was holding its breath under the weight of all that snow. In these silences, Clara could hear the soft, rhythmic whisper of the flakes accumulating, burying them deeper and deeper in the heart of winter. In this small, isolated world of firelight and shadows, time began to lose its shape. Days were measured not by the sun, which was a pale, forgotten memory, but by the simple, repeating rhythm of survival. Clara's initial terror, a sharp and constant thing, slowly began to soften at the edges. It did not vanish, but it receded, like a tide going out, leaving behind a vast and barren shore of watchful caution. The man, Elias, was the architect of this strange peace. He moved through their shared confinement with a deep and abiding quietness. He demanded nothing from her, not a word, not a look, not a single gesture of gratitude. His silence was not empty. It was a presence, a solid wall he built around her, protecting her not only from the storm, but from the expectations of the world she had fled. In the house of her husband, silence had been a weapon, a prelude to violence. Here, in this cabin, it was a gift It was safety. She watched him. She learned the cadence of his movements, the gentle way he stoked the fire, the steady strength in his hands as he sharpened his axe, the careful manner in which he measured their dwindling supply of flour. He rose before the barest hint of gray light touched the window, and his first act was always to build up the fire, pushing back the cold that seeped through the walls during the night. He would make coffee and leave a tin mug for her on the hearth, always in the same spot, before retreating to his side of the room. He gave her space as if it were a physical commodity, an offering as vital as food and warmth. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to move within that space. At first, she would only scurry from her bed of furs by the fire to the bucket of water in the corner. Then, one day, while he was outside in a brief lull in the snowfall, clearing a path to the woodpile, she took the worn broom from its hook and swept the hearth. It was a small act, a tiny assertion of her existence in this place. But when he returned and saw it, he said nothing. He simply nodded, a barely perceptible motion, and the quiet rhythm of their life shifted, just a fraction. To include her, they began to share the chores, an unspoken agreement that grew between them. She would mend his clothes, her fingers still clumsy but determined, stitching the tears in his heavy canvas coat. The needle felt foreign in her hand, in her married life. Such tasks were for servants, and her hands were meant to be soft and idle, another ornament her husband owned. Now, the simple, repetitive motion of the needle was calming, a focus for her fractured thoughts. She learned to boil snow for water, a task that seemed to take hours, the pot on the fire hissing and steaming, filling the cabin with a damp, clean smell. He, in turn, chopped the wood, his axe falling with a steady, metronomic beat that became the new pulse of their days. He would bring the split logs inside, their frozen surfaces smelling of pine and frost, and stack them neatly by the hearth. He never seemed to tire. He was a part of the wilderness that surrounded them, as sturdy and enduring as the ancient trees. One evening, as she was sorting through a small bag of dried beans, her eyes fell upon a small, carved object on the mantelpiece. It was a bird, a robin perhaps, carved from a piece of light-colored wood, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. It was beautifully done, the work of a patient and gentle hand. It seemed so out of place in this stark, masculine space. She looked over at Elias, who was cleaning his traps by the firelight.
"Did you make this?"
she asked, her voice quiet, unused. It was the first question she had ever asked him. He looked up, his hands stilling. He followed her gaze to the mantel. A shadow passed over his face, a deep and ancient sorrow that seemed to pull at the corners of his eyes. "My wife, Sarah. She liked robins," he said, his voice a low rumble. "She said they were the first promise of spring." He said nothing more, and Clara did not press, but the word wife hung in the air between them. It explained the sadness in him, the solitude that was more than just a preference. It was a wound. A few days later, the story came out, not in a rush, but in spare, hard sentences, like stones pulled from a deep well. He was talking about the shootout in town, the one the storekeeper had mentioned. She had not asked, but he began to speak of it as he stared into the fire, as if the flames were a confessional. "There was a woman," he began, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Her husband was a freight driver, drank hard, had a heavy hand. He was beating her in the street, right there in the mud, for everyone to see. No one did anything. They just watched." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I was coming out of the smithy. I saw it." He stopped speaking for a long time. Clara sat perfectly still, her mending forgotten in her lap. "Sarah, my wife, she was with me. She was with child." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "She told me to help, to do something, so I did. I told him to let her go. He and his friend, they were drunk. They went for their guns." He looked down at his own large hands, as if seeing them for the first time. I was faster. The story hung there, incomplete.
But your wife?
Clara whispered, unable to stop herself. The child? It was not the freight driver or his friend, Elias said, his voice thick with a grief that time had not touched. There was a third man, a thief, saw the commotion and thought he could rob the assay office while no one was looking. He ran out, firing wild. A stray bullet. He closed his eyes. She died right there, in my arms. The babe was lost with her. He fell silent. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of the wind, which had risen again. Clara finally understood. He was not just a man haunted by a violent act. He was a man living in the ruins of a good deed. He had saved one woman, but in doing so, had lost everything he held dear. The town feared him for his violence, but she saw now that he was defined not by the violence he had committed, but by the compassion that had driven him to it. A fragile tendril of trust, which had been slowly growing in the darkness of her fear, took root. This man understood suffering. He would not be the cause of it. The knowledge did not bring her peace. The past was not a distant country. It was a hungry wolf that stalked the edges of her sleep. The nightmares began. She would be back in that house in Missouri, the air thick with unspoken menace. She would feel the weight of her husband's hand, smell the whiskey on his breath, hear the terrible, soft sound of his belt being unbuckled. She would wake up with a strangled cry, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the scent of her own fear filling the small cabin. Each time, the sequence was the same. She would cry out, and in the darkness, she would hear the rustle of Elias rising from his bed. He would not approach her. He would not speak. He would move to the hearth, and with a few deft movements, he would coax the dying embers back to life. A small flame would flicker, then grow, casting its warm, dancing light across the room. Pushing back the shadows, he would add a log, and then another, until the fire was a steady, comforting presence. And then he would sit on the floor, on the other side of the hearth, his back to her, a silent guardian keeping watch until the trembling in her limbs subsided and she drifted back into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. He never touched her. He only ever lit the fire. One night, the wolf caught her. The nightmare was worse than usual. A vivid replaying of the last night in that house, the one that had finally given her the courage, born of pure terror, to flee. She woke up not with a cry, but with a full-throated scream that echoed in the small, silent cabin. She shot upright, tangled in the furs, her body slick with a cold sweat. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. She was blind with panic, the dream still clinging to her, its foul breath on her neck. Then she heard the familiar sound, the scrape of flint on steel, a spark, a flicker of light. Elias was there, at the hearth, his profile etched against the growing flames. He built the fire, his movements as calm and steady as ever. When it was burning brightly, he did not retreat to his bed. He simply sat down on the floor, his knees drawn up, and rested his forearms on them. He stared into the fire, offering her his presence, a solid, unmovable anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear. She watched him for a long time, the frantic beating of her heart slowly quieting. The firelight warmed her skin, and his stillness calmed her soul. He was not going to hurt her. He was not going to take advantage of her weakness. He was just there.
He told me,
she said, her voice a raw, broken thing, that he owned me, that my body, my thoughts, even the air I breathed, belonged to him. Elias did not turn. He remained staring into the fire, listening. The words began to pour out of her, hesitant at first, then in a torrent, as if a dam had broken. I was 14 when my father sold me to him in marriage. He was a wealthy man, respected. He wanted a young wife, a quiet one. She laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. He got what he paid for. I learned to be quiet. I learned to be invisible. I learned that a spoken opinion, a book read without permission, a glance held too long with a shopkeeper, all of it was a transgression, an offense that required correction. She traced the faint, silvery line of a scar on her forearm, hidden in the firelight. He kept me like a prized horse, well-fed, well-groomed, and locked in the stable. But one day, a traveling preacher spoke of a woman's soul being her own, a thing that belonged only to God. I believed him. I told my husband that my soul was not his to command. Tears began to trace paths through the grime on her cheeks. That was the last time I spoke my mind in that house. He beat me for it. He said he would beat the rebellion out of me, that he would teach me my place. That night, when he was asleep in a drunken stupor, I just ran. She finished, her story told, her shame laid bare in the quiet cabin. She expected disgust, or perhaps pity. What she did not expect was the response that came. Elias turned his head, just slightly, and looked at her over his shoulder. His gray eyes were clear and steady, and they held no judgment, only a profound and solemn understanding. "No man owns another's voice," he said. His words were not gentle, not comforting. They were a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the stone of the mountains, a truth she had been starved of for so long she had forgotten its taste. The next day, she saw him writing in a leather-bound journal. He did it often, sitting at the table, his pen scratching across the page for hours. She had always assumed it was a ledger or trapping records, but now, filled with a strange, new courage, she asked what he wrote. "Letters," he said, not looking up. "To whom?" "To my wife," he replied. "But," she started, confused. "I know she cannot read them," he said, finally raising his eyes to meet hers. "But I write them all the same. It helps to put the words somewhere." Later that day, when he went out to check his snares, she saw the journal lying open on the table. Beside it was a fresh sheet of paper and a sharpened pencil. It was a silent invitation. Hesitantly, she sat down. She picked up the pencil. Her hand shook. For years, her thoughts had been a frantic, silent circling in the prison of her own mind. To write them down felt like a dangerous, radical act. But Elias's words echoed in her head. No man owns another's voice. She began to write. At first, just single words. Cold, fear, hunger. Then, phrases. The wind in the pines, the heat of the fire, the taste of coffee. And then, sentences. "My name is Clara. I am 22 years old. I am alive." The scratching of her pencil filled the silent cabin. It was a small sound, but it was the sound of a woman reclaiming her own story, one word at a time. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with her voice. The cabin became Clara's entire universe, a small, warm planet adrift in a sea of white. The relentless rhythm of the storm outside was answered by a new rhythm within its walls, a quiet cadence of survival that slowly began to knit her frayed soul back together. The simple, repetitive tasks of their days became a kind of prayer, a meditation in motion, the scraping of a spoon in a pot, the steady thump of Elias's axe, the soft scratch of her pencil across the pages of his journal. These were the sounds of her own slow healing. The constant, gnawing hunger that had been her companion for so long was replaced by the simple, savory warmth of rabbit stew and pan-fried bread. Color began to seep back into her cheeks, a faint blush of rose against the pallor of her skin. The violent trembling in her hands, a tremor born of fear and starvation, subsided. She could hold a mug of coffee now without spilling it, could thread a needle on the first try. She was inhabiting her own body again, not as a cage of pain and memory, but as a home. Her nightmares did not vanish entirely, but they came less often, their sharp edges dulled by the deep, uncomplicated safety of her days. She would still wake sometimes with a gasp, the ghost of her husband's shadow falling across her, But the fear would recede almost instantly when she saw the steady, reassuring glow of the embers in the hearth and the dark, still shape of Elias asleep in his bed across the room. He was a mountain, a bulwark against the terrors of the night. One afternoon, as the snow fell in thick, silent curtains outside the window, Elias took his rifle down from the pegs above the door. He began to clean it with a quiet, focused intensity, his large hands surprisingly deft with the small, oiled rags. Clara watched him, her pencil stilled above her journal. The sight of the weapon did not frighten her. In her former life, a gun had been a symbol of her husband's power, another tool to ensure her compliance. But in Elias's hands, it looked like what it was, a simple tool for hunting, for survival. He looked up and caught her watching him. He did not smile, he rarely did, but the stern lines of his face seemed to soften. "Have you ever fired a gun?" he asked. She shook her head. "My husband did not permit it." Elias finished his work, the rifle gleaming dully in the firelight. He held it out to her. "Stock first. You should learn." She recoiled slightly, the old fear a reflexive thing. "I have no need. I am not a hunter." "This ain't about hunting," he said, his voice low and serious. He stood up and walked to her, placing the heavy rifle in her hands. It was surprisingly weighty, cold and solid. "It's about control. A thing like this, it has power in it, but it does nothing on its own. It does only what the person holding it decides. To learn it is to learn a piece of yourself, to know that you can hold this power and not be afraid of it, to know that you are the one who chooses." His words resonated deep within her. He was not talking about shooting. He was talking about the force of will, about taking command of one's own life. The next morning, during a rare break in the snowfall, he took her outside. The cold was a clean, sharp shock to the lungs. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the trees laden with snow, the silence immense. He set up a tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock of the rifle against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. His instructions were simple, direct, his voice calm. He stood behind her, but he did not touch her, respecting the invisible boundary that still existed between them. "Breathe out," he said. "Squeeze the trigger slow. Do not pull it." She did as he said. She lined up the sights, the tiny can a distant speck. She held her breath, then let it out slowly. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The explosion was a deafening crack that shattered the winter silence. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder with a force that sent a painful jolt through her whole body, and she stumbled backward. The can on the post remained untouched. A flush of shame and failure washed over her. But Elias simply walked over and picked up the rifle from where she had dropped it in the snow. "Again," he said, his face unreadable. They stayed out there for an hour. She fired again and again. She missed. She missed again. Her shoulder ached and her ears rang, but she did not stop. With each shot, she became less afraid of the noise, less intimidated by the raw power she held in her hands. She began to understand what he meant. She was controlling the explosion, containing it, directing it. Finally, on her last shot, there was a satisfying ping, and the can leaped from the post and disappeared into the snow. A small, involuntary cry of triumph escaped her lips. She turned to look at Elias. He was watching her, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a real smile on his face. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes. In that moment, the last of her fear of him evaporated completely, replaced by something warmer, something more complex and unsettling. The snow, however, was relentless. The brief respite ended, and the sky closed in again. They were still trapped, 2 people in a single room. The world shrunk to the space between 4 log walls. And with the fear gone, a new and different kind of tension began to grow in the space between them. It was a quiet, humming thing, an awareness of each other that had not existed before. Clara found her eyes drawn to him more often, to the way the firelight caught the silver in his dark hair, the strength in his forearms as he split kindling, the deep lines around his eyes when he was lost in thought. One afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds for a few precious hours, and the world outside glittered as if it were coated in diamonds. The temperature rose just enough to feel like a false spring. Elias announced he was going to the creek behind the cabin to wash. It was a short but brutal trip, requiring him to break through the ice with an axe. Clara was inside, kneading dough for their evening meal, when she happened to glance out the window. The creek was just visible through a break in the trees, and she saw him. He was standing waist-deep in the churning, icy water, his back to her. He had stripped to the waist, and his skin was pale against the snow. She saw the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders, the long, clean lines of his body. She saw a map of scars there too, old and white, telling a story of a life she could only imagine. Her hands stilled in the dough, her breath caught in her throat. She had seen her husband's body, of course, but that had been an act of ownership, a thing to be used and discarded. This was different. This was a man, powerful and alive, in his natural element. A jolt, sharp and unfamiliar, went through her. It was a feeling she had never known, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the man standing in the freezing water. She pulled back from the window as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. The feeling terrified her. It was a betrayal of her own hard-won safety. To feel this way was to be vulnerable, to be open to the kind of pain she had sworn she would never risk again. Her trauma screamed at her that to be seen as desirable was to be seen as a thing to be possessed. To be available was to be in danger. For the next few days, she avoided him. She retreated back into herself, becoming quiet and watchful again. She kept her eyes downcast, answered his questions with single words, and made sure to always be on the opposite side of the cabin. She could feel his confusion, a silent question in the air between them. But he did not press her. He simply gave her the distance she seemed to need, his own quietness a mirror of hers. But the cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt small and charged, every silence crackling with unspoken tension. She could not live like this. The fear was a prison of her own making, and she was tired of being a prisoner. She had faced down starvation, freezing cold, and the ghosts of her past. She would not be defeated by the ghost of a feeling she did not even understand. That night, after their silent meal, Elias sat by the hearth, adding wood to the fire. The storm had returned with a vengeance, the wind howling like a pack of wolves around the corners of the cabin. Clara rose from the table, her heart a slow, heavy drum. She walked to the furs where she slept, her movements deliberate. She stood there for a long moment, her back to him. Then, with a steady hand, she began to unbutton her dress. She did it slowly, not out of modesty, but out of a sense of ceremony. This was an act for herself. She was not undressing for a man. She was shedding the last of her shame. She let the dress fall to the floor. She stood in her thin chemise, the firelight warm on her skin. She could feel his stillness behind her, could feel the moment he realized what she was doing. She heard the soft thud of a log as he set it down. He turned away. It was an instinctive gesture, a sign of the deep respect he had always shown her. But he did not leave. He did not retreat to his own bed. He simply turned his face to the stone of the fireplace, granting her privacy while still remaining present. The gesture, that small act of kindness, gave her the last bit of courage she needed. She took a breath.
"You can look,"
she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room.
"I'm not ashamed anymore."
Slowly, he turned back. His eyes met hers. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw in his gaze none of the greedy, possessive hunger she had known her entire life. There was no lust in his eyes. There was only a profound and quiet reverence. He saw not just her body, but the story it told. He saw the faint, silvery scars on her arms, the ugly, faded bruise on her ribs. He saw them not as imperfections, not as marks of shame, but as the testaments of a survivor. He was not looking at an object. He was witnessing a soul. And under the safety of that gaze, the last of her defenses crumbled. The tears came, hot and silent. They were not tears of sorrow or pain, but of release. A great, shuddering wave of grief for the girl she had been and gratitude for the woman she was becoming washed over her. He rose and came to her, moving as quietly as a shadow. He did not reach for her body, did not try to hold her. He simply knelt before her and took her hand. His hand was large and calloused, engulfing hers completely. It was a touch that asked for nothing. It only offered strength. He did not let go. They sat there for a long time, the firelight flickering between them, the storm raging outside. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and his thumb moved in a slow, gentle circle across her knuckles. It was not the beginning of a passion, but the start of a peace, a silent promise made in the heart of the storm. It began with a sound Clara had not heard in what felt like a lifetime, the gentle, persistent drip of water. For weeks, the world had been muted, muffled by the ceaseless, silent fall of snow. The only sounds had been the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. But now, a new sound had entered their small universe. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of a world thawing, of a prison's walls beginning to melt. She sat up from her bed of furs, her heart giving a strange, uncertain lurch that was equal parts hope and dread. A thin, watery sunlight, the first she had seen in over a month, streamed through the cabin's single window, painting a pale yellow rectangle on the rough-hewn floorboards. The light was weak, but it was there. The siege was over. Elias was already awake, standing by the open cabin door, looking out at the transformed landscape. The air that drifted in was still cold, but it had lost its vicious, biting edge. It carried a new scent, the smell of damp earth and wet pine, the scent of a world reawakening. The cabin, which had been her sanctuary, her entire existence, suddenly felt small, confining. The world outside, the one she had fled, was waiting. He turned, his silhouette dark against the blinding white snow. "The Chinook came in the night," he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. "The snow will be heavy and wet, but the trail to town should be passable by tomorrow." Town. The word had landed in the quiet room like a stone. Redemption Gap. A place of hard stares and harder judgments. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The fragile peace of the morning shattered. They ate their breakfast in a silence that was different from their usual comfortable quiet. It was filled with the unspoken reality of their situation. Their time in this isolated bubble, this world built for two, was coming to an end. After they had finished, Elias did not immediately begin his chores as he usually did. He sat at the table across from her, his large hands resting on the wooden surface, his gray eyes serious. "Clara," he began, and the sound of her own name, spoken so plainly in his low voice, made her look up. When a person is lost, the first thing they need is to find their way, but the next is to reclaim what is theirs. You have a name, a life that was yours before it was taken from you. The law might be a clumsy and unfair thing, but it is the only tool we have. He paused, letting the words settle. The sheriff in town, a man named Abernathy. He is a decent man, for the most part. He listens. We can go to him. We can tell him your story. We can make it so you do not have to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. We can make it so Clara is your name again, not just in this cabin, but in the eyes of the world. His offer was a lifeline, a path back to a self she thought was gone forever, but the thought of it terrified her. To tell her story to a stranger, a man with the power of the law, to subject herself to his questions, his potential disbelief, his pity. It felt like stripping herself bare again, not in the safety of the firelight, but under the cold, harsh glare of public scrutiny. And what of the town? She remembered the faces, the whispers, the immediate and damning judgment in their eyes. She looked around the small cabin, at the stone hearth that had warmed her, the table where she had written her first free thoughts, the walls that had protected her from the storm. This place was safe. The world outside was not.
I do not know if I can,
she whispered, her voice trembling. Elias did not try to persuade her. He simply watched her, his gaze steady. The choice is yours, he said, and only yours. You can stay here as long as you need. Nothing has to change. But I wanted you to know that the path is there. If you choose to walk it. She spent the day in a turmoil of indecision. She swept the floor, mended a shirt, wrote in the journal, but her mind was elsewhere, wrestling with the two great fears that governed her life, the fear of being trapped and the fear of being seen. That evening, as she stared into the fire, she thought of his words. You have the right to walk free. Freedom was not just the absence of walls. It was the ability to walk in the sun and claim your own name. The next morning, as he was preparing to go out and check his traps, she spoke. I will go with you, she said, her voice small but firm. I will go to the town. Elias stopped, his hand on the door latch. He looked at her, and a slow, grave nod was his only reply. The ride to Redemption Gap was a slow, arduous journey through a world in the process of messy rebirth. The deep, powdery snow of the storm had turned to a heavy, wet slush that clung to the horses' hooves and made for treacherous footing. The sun was brilliant, almost painfully so, reflecting off the vast expanse of white until the whole world seemed to shimmer and burn. Water dripped from every pine bough, and the sound of the melting world was a constant murmur around them. Elias rode ahead, his big roan breaking a trail for her. He had insisted she ride his gentler pack mule, a sure-footed animal that picked its way through the drifts with patient determination. They rode in silence for hours, a silence that was not empty, but filled with a shared sense of purpose. For Clara. Every step the mule took away from the cabin felt like a step into a dangerous, unknown country. She clutched the saddle horn, her knuckles white, her body braced for the judgment she knew was coming. As they neared the town, the pristine wilderness gave way to the churned mud and chaos of the main street. Redemption Gap looked even grimmer in the harsh light of day than it had in the swirling snow. The buildings seemed to sag. The boardwalks were slick with mud, and the faces of the people they passed were pinched and weary from the long confinement of the storm. And then the whispers began. It started as soon as they rode into view. A man loading a wagon stopped his work to stare, his mouth slightly agape. A group of women clustered outside the general store fell silent, their heads turning in unison, their eyes like a flock of birds, all landing on her. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased. Doors opened a crack, faces peering out before quickly shutting again. The town of Redemption Gap held its collective breath, and then it began to exhale its venom in hushed, sibilant whispers. Clara felt their gazes like a physical assault. She could hear the unspoken words, could feel the shape of their assumptions. She was the woman Elias Thorne had carried out of town, the saloon girl, the fallen woman he had kept isolated in his cabin for weeks. She tried to hold her head high, to remember the strength she had found by the fire, but it was a fragile thing, a new green shoot trying to push its way through frozen ground. Elias seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps he was simply used to them. He rode with his back straight, his eyes fixed ahead, a grim and solitary figure. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and then turned to help her down. His hands on her waist were steady and impersonal, but his nearness was a small comfort in the face of the town's hostile curiosity. "Sheriff's office is this way," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. They began to walk, their boots sinking into the thick mud. They had to pass the group of women who were still standing sentinel outside the store. As they drew near, Clara tried to fix her gaze on the door of the sheriff's office, to create a small tunnel of vision that included only her destination, excluding the hard, unforgiving eyes that followed her. But she could not exclude the sound. A woman's voice, sharp and laced with a self-righteous satisfaction, cut through the air. It was not a shout, but a whisper designed to carry, "Look at the trash Elias Thorne dragged in from the storm. Some men have no shame." Trash! The word was a slap in the face. It struck her with a physical force, knocking the air from her lungs and the fragile courage from her heart. Everything inside her recoiled. The color drained from her face, and she felt herself shrinking, physically trying to become smaller, to disappear. All the progress she had made, all the healing that had begun in the quiet solitude of the cabin, felt like a lie. In the eyes of the world, she was nothing, less than nothing. She was trash. Elias stopped. He had heard it too. He turned his head and saw the look on her face, the way the light had been extinguished from her eyes, the way she now stared at the muddy ground as if it were the only safe place to look. A cold, quiet fury settled over his features. The air around him seemed to grow still and dangerous. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the women. There were 3 of them, dressed in dark, respectable wool, their faces pinched with piety. They took an involuntary step back as he approached. He was not a man to be trifled with, and his anger, though quiet, was a palpable thing. He stopped a few feet from them, his height and breadth seeming to block out the sun. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he spoke, the words were low and clear and carried the weight of iron. "This woman's name is Clara," he said, his eyes moving from one face to the next, pinning them with his gaze. "You will have the decency to use it, and you will show her the same respect you would show any other person who has suffered a great hardship. Or you will answer to me." He did not wait for a reply. He simply turned his back on their shocked, indignant faces and walked back to Clara's side. He put a hand lightly on her back, a gesture of solidarity. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's see the sheriff." But the sheriff, they were told by a young, nervous deputy, was out of town. He had ridden out to check on some outlying homesteads after the storm and was not expected back for a day or 2. The news was another blow, stranding them in this hostile town. As they stepped back out onto the boardwalk, their path was blocked by a man in a dusty black coat and a round-brimmed hat. He was tall and thin, with a face that seemed perpetually arranged in an expression of sorrowful concern. "Brother Thorne," the man said, his voice sonorous and smooth. "I am the Reverend Miller, a humble servant of the Lord, traveling through this wilderness to tend to his flock. I could not help but witness the disturbance, and I see this poor, lost soul by your side." He turned his compassionate, pitying gaze on Clara. "My child," he said, his voice dripping with a cloying sweetness. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. He has brought you out of the storm and into the light of this community. But the path to redemption is a narrow one, and it must be walked with a humble and repentant heart. Our small mission here offers a place for women such as yourself, a place to wash away the sins of the past through honest work and prayer. The Lord will forgive your trespasses if you are willing to kneel before Him and accept your penance." He was offering her a prison of a different kind, a life of scrubbing floors and saying prayers, a public performance of shame to appease their righteous God. He saw her not as a victim, but as a sinner, a stain that needed to be cleansed. All the rage and terror and grief that she had been swallowing for years rose up in her throat. She looked up, not at Elias, but directly into the preacher's placid, knowing eyes. The woman who had been afraid to speak, the woman who had been beaten for having a voice, found it now, in the muddy street of a town that despised her. Her voice, when she spoke, did not sound like her own. It was low and clear, and it did not tremble. "Reverend," she said, and the man's benevolent smile faltered at the cold fury in her tone. "I am sure you mean well, but you are mistaken. I am not lost. I was taken. I have not sinned. I was sinned against. She took a step closer to him, and it was he who flinched. I do not need saving, she said, the words ringing with the absolute clarity of truth. I need to be believed. She turned then and walked away, leaving the Reverend Miller standing in the street with his mouth agape, his sermon left unspoken. Elias followed a half-step behind her, a silent, formidable guard. They took a room at the town's only inn, a dreary, drafty place that smelled of stale beer and boiled cabbage. The innkeeper, a sour-faced woman who had clearly heard the gossip, took their money with a grimace and gave them a key to a room at the back. The room was small and cold, containing a lumpy bed, a single chair, and a washstand with a cracked porcelain basin. The window looked out onto a muddy alley. The hostile silence of the town seemed to seep through the thin walls. They did not speak of what had happened. There was nothing to say. The battle had been fought, and the wounds were raw. Without discussion, Elias took one of the thin blankets from the bed and made a space for himself on the floor in the corner, as far from the bed as the small room would allow. Clara took the other blanket and curled up on the sagging mattress, her back to him. The day had exhausted her, stripped her bare. The strength she had shown in defying the preacher had drained away, leaving behind a hollow ache. Hours passed. The room grew dark. The sounds of the town faded to a distant murmur. Clara lay awake, staring at the faint rectangle of the window, feeling the weight of her past and the uncertainty of her future pressing down on her. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Then, a voice came out of the darkness from the other side of the room. It was Elias, his voice a low, quiet rumble that was somehow more comforting than any shouted promise. You have the right to walk free, he said, the words a simple, solid truth in the cold, dark room. He paused, and then he added, but I will walk beside you, if you want. She closed her eyes. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She was not alone. She did not know what the next day would bring, what the sheriff would say, or what new dangers lay ahead. But in that moment, it was enough. He would walk beside her. It was the only promise she needed. The journey back to the cabin was a passage through a different kind of silence. It was not the oppressive silence of the storm, nor the tense, watchful quiet of their first days together. It was a silence born of a shared ordeal, a fragile truce signed in the cold, dark room of the inn. They had faced the town's judgment together, and in doing so, a new and unspoken thing had been forged between them. The world had tried to define her as trash, and he had stood and declared her a person. It was a gift more profound than warmth or food. The cabin, when they reached it, felt different. It was no longer a temporary shelter from a blizzard, but a place of conscious and deliberate rebuilding. The air inside was still and safe. Here, the whispers of redemption gap could not reach. Here, she was not a scandal or a sinner. She was just Clara. The rhythm they fell into was one of healing. It was in the small, hopeful acts that they began to piece together the promise of a future. From a small pouch she had bought at the general store with the money from her silver earring, which Elias had insisted on giving her back, Clara planted a few precious wildflower seeds in a tin can on the windowsill. It was a foolish act in the deep winter, but it was an act of faith, a belief in the eventual coming of spring. Elias, for his part, began mending the section of fence that had collapsed under the weight of the snow. He worked with a steady, unhurried pace, his movements speaking of permanence, of a future he intended to inhabit. The charged tension that had once filled the small space was gone, replaced by a deep and quiet comfort. They moved around each other with an easy grace, their separate orbits now intertwined. She would read to him in the evenings from the single book he owned, a worn copy of Shakespeare, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing page. He would listen, his head tilted, his eyes on the fire, a quiet appreciation in his stillness. They were not lovers. Not yet. They were something rarer and perhaps more vital. They were allies. They were two solitary souls who had found, in the heart of the wilderness, a reason to stand together. This fragile peace lasted for nearly a week. It was a time of such quiet contentment that Clara began to allow herself to believe that her past was truly behind her, a ghost that had finally been laid to rest. But the past is a patient hunter, and it had been tracking her across 1,000 miles. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky the color of lead. Two riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, dark figures against the endless white. Clara was outside, gathering an armful of firewood. When she saw them, a cold dread, primal and familiar, seized her. Her blood turned to ice in her veins, and the firewood tumbled from her numb arms into the snow. One of the men was tall and dressed in a fine city coat, his posture rigid and authoritative. The other was a slighter, harder-looking man, his face weathered and cruel, a gun belt slung low on his hips. Even from a distance, she recognized the first man. It was Marcus Fletcher, her husband's younger brother. Elias came out of the cabin, drawn by the sudden silence. He took one look at the riders, then at the terror on Clara's face, and he understood. He moved to stand slightly in front of her, his body a solid shield. He did not reach for the rifle leaning just inside the door. His stillness was his weapon. The two men rode into the clearing and dismounted. Marcus Fletcher's eyes swept over the cabin with a disdainful air before they settled on Clara. There was no warmth in his gaze, only the cold appraisal of a man calculating the value of a piece of property. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any real emotion, "your foolish game is at an end. You have caused our family a great deal of embarrassment. My brother has been patient, but his patience has its limits. You will come with us now." The other man, the bounty hunter, said nothing. He simply watched Elias, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol, a look of bored professionalism on his face. Clara felt the old terror rise up and choke her. This was the voice of her prison, the calm, reasonable tone that always preceded the cruelty. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the snow, but her feet were rooted to the spot. "This is my land," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And this woman is under my protection. She is not going anywhere with you." Marcus Fletcher finally deigned to look at Elias, his lip curling in a slight sneer. "And who are you? Some backwoods trapper who fancies himself her savior? I assure you, you are mistaken. This woman is my brother's wife, bound by law and by God. She is a runaway. And this man," he gestured to the bounty hunter, "is Jedediah Stone. He is a duly appointed agent, here to assist me in recovering what is lawfully ours. We have a warrant, signed by a judge in St. Louis. I suggest you step aside before you find yourself on the wrong side of the law." "Your warrant from St. Louis means nothing here," Elias said, his voice flat. "This is Wyoming territory. We have our own laws, and no piece of paper gives you the right to threaten a person on my property." "She is not a person," Marcus said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "She is a wife, and she is coming with us." He took a step forward. It was then that Clara found a sliver of her voice. "No," she said, the word a ragged whisper. But it was enough. Marcus stopped, his eyes narrowing. "You will be silent," he commanded, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the familiar ugliness beneath. "She will speak whenever she pleases," Elias countered, his body tensing. The air crackled with the threat of violence. For a long moment, no one moved. Jedediah Stone's eyes flickered between Elias and the cabin door, calculating the odds. Finally, Marcus seemed to make a decision. A thin, unpleasant smile touched his lips. "Very well," he said. "If you wish to stand on the niceties of territorial law, then we will abide by them. We will take this matter to the town and let the sheriff decide. But make no mistake. Trapper, the law is on my side. It always is." He turned to the bounty hunter. "Mr. Stone, we will retire to the town. We will see the sheriff in the morning." With a final, contemptuous look at Elias and Clara, they mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a silence that was more terrifying than their threats. The return to Redemption Gap was a grim procession. This time, they were not seeking help, but preparing for a battle they knew they were likely to lose. Sheriff Abernathy was back, a tall, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and the sad eyes of someone who had seen too much of the worst of human nature. He listened patiently in his small, cluttered office, first to Marcus Fletcher's smooth, confident account, and then to Elias's spare, direct defense. Clara sat on a hard wooden bench, a silent spectator at the trial of her own life. Marcus produced the marriage certificate, a crisp, official-looking document that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He spoke of his brother's good name, of Clara's delicate constitution, of her fanciful and disobedient nature. He painted a picture of a concerned family simply trying to bring a troubled woman back into the fold. When it was Elias's turn, he spoke of Clara's condition when he had found her, of the bruises and the fear, but he had no proof. Only his word against the legal document in Marcus's hand. Sheriff Abernathy sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "I do not doubt your sincerity, but the law in these matters is specific. A marriage contract is a binding thing. A wife is her husband's legal responsibility. Unless you can provide concrete proof of cruelty, something more than this woman's word against her husband's, my hands are tied." "Her word should be enough," Elias said, his voice tight with a frustration that bordered on rage. "In a perfect world, perhaps," the sheriff said, "but we do not live in a perfect world. The law does not recognize a woman's testimony against her own husband. It is a family matter, to be settled within the family." The town, predictably, was divided. The news of the confrontation spread like wildfire. The respectable women, the ones who had scorned Clara in the street, sided firmly with Marcus Fletcher. It was a matter of principle, of maintaining the proper order of things. A wife's place was with her husband, no matter the circumstances. To suggest otherwise was to threaten the very foundation of their society. But there were others who took Elias's side, the blacksmith, a burly man who had seen Elias's quiet strength firsthand, grumbled that no man had the right to treat a woman like a dog. A few of the trappers and cowboys on the edge of town, men who lived by their own code of honor, nodded in agreement. They respected Elias Thorne, and if he said the woman needed protecting, then that was good enough for them. The town split into two camps, arguing the matter in the saloon and over fence posts, turning Clara's private agony into a public spectacle. That night, Elias was walking back to the inn from the livery stable when they came for him. Marcus was not there. He was a man who preferred to have others do his dirty work. It was Jedediah Stone and two rough-looking men he had hired from the saloon. Clara was in their small room at the inn, staring out the window at the muddy street below. When she heard the commotion, it was the sound of a scuffle, a grunt of pain, the sickening thud of a fist hitting flesh. She peered into the darkness of the alley beside the livery. She saw shadows moving, and then she saw Elias. He was fighting all three of them, but the odds were impossible. She saw one of the men slam a heavy piece of wood against his side. She saw him stagger, and then another man hit him from behind. He went down. A scream rose in her throat, but it died before it could escape. She watched in frozen, helpless horror as they kicked him, their boots landing with brutal, sickening force. It was for her. This was her fault. This man, this quiet, decent man who had shown her nothing but kindness, was being beaten half to death in a muddy alley because of her. The sight broke something inside her. The fear, the shame, the years of silent submission. It all burned away in a white-hot flash of protective fury. She would not let this happen. She would not hide while he suffered for her. She flew out of the room and down the stairs, her only thought to get to him. But by the time she reached the street, the men were gone, having melted back into the shadows. Elias was lying in the mud, trying to push himself up, his face a mask of blood. She ran to him, falling to her knees at his side, her hands hovering over his broken body, not knowing how to help. The next morning, an official hearing was convened in the saloon, the largest room in town. A circuit judge had been due to arrive in a week, but Sheriff Abernathy had decided he could not wait. The town was a powder keg, and he needed to put an end to the matter. The entire population of Redemption Gap seemed to be crammed into the room. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and simmering hostility. Elias was there, sitting beside her at a small table. His face was swollen and bruised. One eye puffed shut, his ribs tightly wrapped, but he sat straight and tall, his one good eye fixed on Marcus Fletcher with an expression of unwavering defiance. Marcus presented his case with a smug, unassailable confidence. He had the law, he had the document, and he had the sympathy of the town's most influential citizens. He painted Elias as a violent meddler and Clara as a hysterical, ungrateful runaway. It seemed an open and shut case. "And so, Your Honor," Marcus concluded, addressing the sheriff, who was acting as judge, "I ask only that you uphold the law and return my brother's property to him." Property. The word echoed in Clara's mind. That is what she was. A thing to be owned, to be returned. She looked at Elias, at his battered face, and she knew she could not stay silent any longer. Slowly, she stood up. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to her.
"I wish to speak,"
she said, her voice shaking, but clear and loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. Marcus laughed, a short, ugly sound.
"She has no legal right to speak in this matter."
"Nevertheless," Sheriff Abernathy said, his eyes on Clara's determined face, "I will hear her."
Clara took a deep breath. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the curious, the hostile, and the sympathetic, and she told them her story. She spoke of being sold at 14, of the years of silence and fear, of the bruises that never fully faded, of the books she was forbidden to read, of the soul her husband had tried to crush. Her voice grew stronger with every word, fueled by a righteous anger that had been simmering for a lifetime. She was not asking for their pity. She was demanding their belief. "You see a marriage certificate,"
she said, her voice ringing with passion.
"I see a bill of sale. You speak of the law, I speak of the truth.
And the truth is that this man's brother did not take a wife. He bought a slave, and I will not go back." When she finished, the room was utterly silent. Her words hung in the air, a raw and undeniable testament. Marcus Fletcher was on his feet, his face purple with rage, shouting that she was a liar, a mad woman. But before he could continue, another voice cut through the commotion, a clear, calm, female voice. "She is not lying?" All heads turned. A woman was standing near the back of the room. She was plainly dressed, with intelligent eyes and a resolute expression. It was the town's new schoolteacher, a Miss Eleanor Gable, who had arrived only a few months prior. She walked to the front of the room.
"My name is Eleanor Gable,"
she said to the sheriff. "Before coming here, I taught for 3 years in Willow Creek, Missouri.
It is a small town,
not 20 miles from the Fletcher estate." She turned and looked directly at Clara. "I remember this woman. Her name was Clara May Thompson. She was my brightest pupil. She loved books more than anyone I have ever known." Miss Gable then turned her gaze on Marcus.
"I also remember when she was married. She was just a girl. She stopped coming to my school. I saw her in town, from time to time. I saw the light go out of her eyes. And yes," she said, her voice hardening, "I saw the bruises, on more than one occasion. I asked her about them once, and the fear in her eyes was something I will never forget. What she says is the truth. Her name is Clara, and she was a child who was sold into bondage.
The schoolteacher's testimony was a thunderclap. She was an educated, respectable woman, an unimpeachable witness. She had given Clara back her name and had validated her truth in a way that no one could deny. Sheriff Abernathy looked from Miss Gable's resolute face to Clara's tear-streaked one, and then to the damning marriage certificate. He picked up the document. "This certificate lists the bride's age as 18, he said, his voice hard. "Miss Gable, you have testified that she was a 14-year-old schoolgirl. That makes this document fraudulent, and a fraudulent contract is no contract at all." He looked at Marcus Fletcher, his eyes like chips of ice. "This marriage is hereby declared invalid. Clara Thompson is a free woman." Then he looked at Jedediah Stone. "And you and your employer will be out of this town by sundown." That evening, back in the small room at the inn, Clara gently cleaned the cuts on Elias's face. The town was quiet. Marcus and Jedediah Stone were gone. She was free. The word was so large, so new, she did not yet know how to hold it. She dabbed a cloth on a deep gash above his eye, her touch as light as a feather. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "All of this—" He reached up and caught her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. He looked at her with his one good eye, and the gaze was so full of a fierce and gentle tenderness that it made her breath catch. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "I would do it again. I would do it 100 more times. For 1 minute of your freedom." The snow was gone. In the weeks that followed the hearing, a great thaw set in, and the world, which had been a stark and simple place of black and white, slowly began to reveal its true and complicated colors. The journey back to the cabin was a slow passage through a landscape of mud and rushing water. The creek behind the cabin, once a frozen, silent thing, was now a roaring, boisterous torrent, alive with the meltwater of the high peaks. For Clara, the world felt new, as if she were seeing it for the first time with eyes that were truly her own. When they arrived, the cabin felt both the same and entirely different. It was still the solid, safe shelter that had saved her life, but it was no longer a refuge from the world. It was the beginning of one. The first thing she did, before even taking off her coat, was to retrieve the small tin can from the windowsill. Outside, in the soft, damp earth near the cabin door, a small patch of ground had been exposed by the melting snow. She knelt, her fingers pushing aside the last of the icy slush, and crumbled the dark soil. It smelled of life, of things sleeping and waiting to grow, with a care that was almost reverent. She planted the wildflower seeds, one by one. It was a small, quiet act, witnessed only by Elias, who stood on the porch, his battered face softened by a look of profound understanding. He did not ask what she was doing. He knew. She was planting a future. They began to build a life. It was a life constructed of small, quiet moments, of unspoken understandings. They needed no one's approval, sought no one's notice. Their world was the clearing, the whispering pines that surrounded it, and the vast, silent sky above. The town of Redemption Gap, with its judgments and its gossip, was a distant memory, a place they had passed through but no longer inhabited. Their days fell into a rhythm that was as steady and natural as the turning of the earth. Elias worked on the long list of repairs the storm had demanded. He mended the fence, re-chinked the logs of the cabin, and cleared the trail of fallen trees. He moved with a quiet, tireless purpose, his strength a comforting and constant presence. Clara, in turn, made the cabin a home. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, patched the curtains with scraps of an old shirt, and learned the simple, satisfying alchemy of turning flour, water, and fire into bread. She was no longer afraid of her own shadow. She would walk in the woods alone, learning the names of the trees and the tracks of the animals from the lessons Elias had begun to teach her. She learned to read the sky for the weather, to find the North Star, to listen to the language of the wilderness. The strength she had found in holding the rifle was now a different kind of strength, a quiet confidence that came not from a weapon, but from a deep and growing knowledge of herself and the world she now called home. One rainy afternoon, Elias was out checking his trap lines, a long and arduous circuit that often kept him away until dusk. The cabin was quiet, filled with the soft, drumming sound of the rain on the roof. Clara was tidying his few possessions, a task she had taken upon herself, when she came across the leather-bound journal he kept on the mantel. It was where she had written her first free words, but she knew it was also something more. It was his history, his confessional. She had never presumed to read his private entries, the letters he wrote to his dead wife, but now, a deep and urgent need to understand him, to know the man who had pieced her back together, overcame her hesitation. With trembling fingers, she opened the journal. She saw her own handwriting first, the pages filled with her thoughts, her fears, her slow and steady rediscovery of her own voice. She turned the pages, going back in time, back before her own arrival. And then she found them. The letters to Sarah. The handwriting was different from her own, a strong, clear script. The words carved into the page. She read one, and then another. They were letters of profound and aching grief, the words of a man adrift in a sea of loss. He wrote of his loneliness, of the crushing silence of the cabin, of the ghost of her laughter that he sometimes thought he heard on the wind. She came to the last one he had written, dated just a few weeks before he had found her. It was different from the others. It was a letter of farewell. "My dearest Sarah," it began. "The winter is hard this year. The cold has settled deep in my bones, and I find I have little will to fight it. The world we were meant to share is an empty place without you. The promise of spring you so loved feels like a lie I can no longer bring myself to believe. I think, perhaps, it is time for me to stop fighting. It is time for me to come and find you. I am so very tired of being here alone." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, a soft gasp escaping her lips. The words were a revelation. She had believed that he had saved her life, but now, reading these words, she understood a deeper truth. In some small, inexplicable way, she had also saved her arrival. Her brokenness, her desperate need had pulled him back from the edge of his own abyss. It had given him a reason to stoke the fire, a reason to fight the cold, a reason to believe in the promise of spring once more. When he returned that evening, soaked from the rain, his face weary from the long day, she was sitting by the fire, the open journal in her lap. He stopped when he saw it, his body tensing for a moment, but there was no anger in his eyes, only a deep and weary sadness. He knew she had a right to see. He came and sat on the hearth opposite her, the firelight flickering between them. He did not speak, but waited. "I read your letters," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "To Sarah." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "You loved her very much," she whispered. It was not a question. "She was my life," he said, his voice a low murmur. Clara closed the journal and held it to her chest. She looked at this quiet, solitary man, at the deep lines of grief etched around his eyes, and she asked the question that had been a silent, unspoken thing between them from the very beginning. "Will you ever stop grieving for her?" Elias was silent for a long time, the only sound the hiss and crackle of the fire and the soft drumming of the rain. When he finally spoke, he turned his head and looked directly at her, his one good eye clear and full of a truth that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will never stop grieving her. I will always carry her memory, right here." He touched his chest, over his heart. "She was the best part of me for a long time." He paused, and his gaze softened, filled with a new and tender light. "But you, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you are the reason I came back to life." The words were a key, unlocking the last guarded chamber of her heart. The rain beat against the roof, and the fire danced in the hearth and in the quiet space between them. A new world was born. Later that night, the rain stopped, and a profound silence fell over the forest. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light across the room. Elias sat on the hearth, staring into the coals, lost in his memories. Clara rose from her chair. She walked to where he sat, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She stood before him, and he looked up, his face a landscape of questions and old sorrows. She did not speak. She simply began to unbutton her dress. It was the same simple calico she had worn for months, mended and patched, a relic of her old life. But as she let it fall to the floor, it was not an act of shedding shame, as it had been before. It was an act of offering. She stood before him in her thin chemise, her body illuminated by the fire's glow. Her scars were not things to be hidden, but a part of the story that had brought her here, to him. This time, he did not turn away. He watched her, his eyes full of a quiet, wondering reverence. And this time, she reached for him first. She extended her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and laid it gently against the rough stubble of his cheek. It was a simple touch, but it was a revolution. It was her choice, her desire, her claim. He closed his eyes for a moment, a shudder passing through his large frame. He then raised his own hand and covered hers, his calloused palm warm and strong against her skin. He did not pull her to him. He did not take. He simply held her hand against his face, a silent acceptance of the gift she was offering. Their love, when it finally came, was not a firestorm. It was not a rushed and desperate claiming. It was as quiet and steady as the coals in the hearth, a slow and deliberate unfolding. It was the tenderness of his hands, so large and strong, as they traced the lines of her scars. Not with pity, but with a kind of gentle awe. It was the trust in her eyes as she looked at him, a trust so complete it was a form of grace. It was a healing, a mending of two broken souls, a love that was not found, but chosen and built, piece by piece, in the quiet heart of the wilderness. Spring arrived, and with it, the world burst into a riot of green. The wildflower seeds Clara had planted by the door sprouted and then bloomed, a splash of defiant blue and yellow against the dark earth. Her life, too, had begun to bloom. Miss Gable, the schoolteacher, rode out to the cabin one day. She had not forgotten the fierce, brave woman she had defended. She spoke of the children at the mission, orphans of the railroad or the mines, girls with no family and no future, who were hungry for knowledge. And so, twice a week, Clara would ride the gentle mule into town. But she did not go to the main street. She went to the small mission church, where a group of 5 orphaned girls, their faces smudged and their eyes bright with curiosity, would be waiting for her. In the dim light of the church, she taught them. She taught them their letters, how to form the words, how to write their own names. She gave them the gift that had been denied to her for so long. She gave them a voice, and in their eager, upturned faces, she saw the reflection of the girl she had once been. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was finally, truly free. Elias, for his part, found his own peace. He finished repairing the fences, his movements sure and steady. He still trapped, still hunted, but there was a new purpose in his work. He was no longer just surviving. He was providing. He was building a life. He still kept his rifle loaded and mounted on the pegs above the door, but it was no longer a symbol of the violence that had shattered his world. It was a tool to protect the new one he had built. It was there not for fear, but for the quiet, unshakable peace of knowing that this home, this life, this woman were safe. One evening, in the late spring, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Clara stepped out of the cabin. She had been inside for some time, and Elias,
who had been splitting the last of the winter logs, turned to see what had kept her. He stopped, the axe falling from his hand. She was wearing a dress of simple, clean white. She had made it herself, painstakingly stitching it together from her old, worn petticoats, washing it in the creek until it was bright as new-fallen snow. In the soft, golden light of the setting sun, she was beautiful, a vision of grace and strength. She was not the broken, starving woman who had stumbled into his life, nor the frightened girl who had hidden from his gaze. She was Clara, whole and healed, her eyes shining with a love that was as deep and quiet as the forest around them. He watched her, his heart full of a quiet awe that was too profound for words. She walked toward him and stopped, a soft, knowing smile on her lips. She looked at him, at the home they had built, at the new life that stretched before them.
"Light the fire,"
she said. He smiled. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect with one another. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and feel free to share your thoughts in English.